Now let's go ahead and dive into today's discussion. I'm pleased to be joined by three reporters from across our newsroom who have been looking at this very question. What has the Trump 2.0 administration meant for different aspects of our coverage? First, we have John Tamari, who's a senior Congress reporter, often writes the Congress Tracker newsletter, and has been looking at the dynamic between congressional Republicans in particular and the president and administration down the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. We have Stephen Lee, who's one of our regulatory reporters with a focus on the EPA, and he's been looking into the dynamics there as the Trump administration has deregulated and found different ways to regulate. Kate Ackley is the author of BIGA's Power Play newsletter and also a senior reporter for Lobbying and Influence, and she's been looking at the world around the White House and Congress and what people have been doing there to influence policy outcomes. So what will we be talking about today? Well, first of all, we're noting that it's been almost exactly a year since Donald Trump rose his hand and took the oath in the Capitol Rotunda, kicking off a new era in Washington and what has been a very busy year. As I noted, with the three speakers we have today, we're going to talk about the relationship between the administration and Congress. We're going to be looking at the regulatory agenda, and we're also going to be looking at how K Street has responded to this era. We're then going to take some questions from you to our three presenters. And then at the end, we're going to close with just a little roundup of some of the key dates to watch coming up, including that January 30th spending deadline, and give you a little update on our coverage of that this morning. But with that, I want to go ahead and bring in the first of our speakers, and that's John Tamari, who covers, as I said, Capitol Hill, and has been looking at the relationship between Congress and the White House. So, John, let me just kick over to you. What are your early observations here after 1 year of Trump 2.0?
Yeah, I mean, well, when you look back at the first day of the Trump administration, the day he was inaugurated, and he had that indoor inauguration, and up on stage with him were all these major business leaders and titans, tech executives, and down, not on the dais, the one group that was not represented, there were members of Congress. They were kind of down on the floor, below the dais, separate from the president. And I think a lot of us saw that as a symbolic gesture and pretty much foreshadowed the relationship between the president and Congress. I think pretty accurately, the president has not shown a lot of need or interest in what Congress is doing other than to either rubber stamp what he wants to do or to just basically stay out of his way. And that's essentially what's happened. There's been an incredible accumulation of power in the White House, the president pushing the bounds of both kind of powers that are understood to belong to the executive, but also far exceeding a lot of either norms that have existed for a long time, and in some cases, legal and ethical rules that have bound other presidents. And as he's accumulated power, the flip side of that is Congress really kind of ceding a lot of ground and losing a lot of power in the dynamic between the two branches of government. And I think that's something that's played out, and you're seeing it right now with the way the president is throwing his weight around on the world stage in a way that lots of members of Congress disagree with, but have not really done anything to stop.
It's a good way to kick off the discussion. And I think one of the aspects that we want to drive home is just the majorities that he's been working with in Congress have been pretty narrow, as we have our balance of power charts that we often use. I'll go ahead and bring that up onto the screen here. Can you just talk a little bit about the other end of this dynamic and what congressional leaders have been trying to do with these very narrow margins they have to work with?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously they had one really massive ambition last year, and that was as they called it, the one big beautiful bill to extend Trump's 2017 tax cuts and pile in all the other legislation they could possibly get into one bill. And it is a significant accomplishment that Republicans managed to do that with such narrow majorities in the two chambers. Now, the issue is that one of the main reasons they were able to do that, particularly in the House side, is that President Trump kept House members in line. He was basically the hammer for Speaker Mike Johnson. Whenever there was a close vote, whenever there was a problem, Johnson has effectively outsourced a lot of his political power to the White House. The concern, I think, as you look forward, is if you're a Republican and you're someone who wants to see more legislation get done, and this is coming from House Republicans, some of them anyway, is that Trump has not shown a lot of interest in further legislation. He has said he doesn't need much more from Congress. And so that discipline that you saw that helped get that one big bill done has evaporated. And even really basic bills are having a hard time getting through the House. Johnson very frequently does not seem to have control of the House floor. The Senate's been a little different story. Senator John Thune has a larger relatively larger majority to work with. He's also a more experienced leader on that side. He had his own kind of political base of support before he became the leader. He's not as reliant as Trump is to keep his conference in line. And so the Senate has operated a little more smoothly from a Republican perspective, but as always, they have the filibuster to deal with. So there's also limits on how much they're going to be able to pass as far as meaningful legislation. So there's not a lot of optimism right now for major legislation coming through later this year, partly because of these narrow majorities. And Democrats in the House, particularly, are able to cause a lot of mischief. If there's just a couple absences, we've seen some personal illnesses on the House side that have reduced Republicans' numbers. On a given day, it's not clear that they can really get anything done. And that's very unusual in the House, which is such a majoritarian institution.
And it's also worth noting that there's the 4 gray circles on the House side there. Those are some vacancies right now. 2 of them caused, I believe, by Democrats and 2 by Republicans. And correct me if I'm wrong, but some of those Democratic seats might get filled first just because of the Sylvester Turner seat that came open last year in Texas, and then the Mikey Sherrill seat that came open in New Jersey. So that could even give Democrats a few more votes there to make life a little more interesting for the GOP.
Yeah, my understanding, if I remember right, I know that the Sylvester seat in Houston will be filled first. That's a Democratic seat. Then most likely the Georgia seat that Marjorie Taylor Greene retired from, so that would be kind of even things up. Then the Mikey Sherrill seat in New Jersey, that'll be a Democratic seat. So Democrats will, I think, towards the end of April, basically add 2 seats, and Republicans will add 1. And that last seat from the death of Congressman Doug LaMalfa in California is not expected to be filled until August. So for a short time here, Democrats will pick up 2 more seats. Republicans will pick up only 1. So as you point out, it's only going to get harder for Mike Johnson going forward.
And you touched a little bit about the lawmaking that was done in that first year of the Trump administration, where here's an example or a list of how the first years have gone for other presidents as well. And we see there were 68 laws signed last year in 2025. I think we've had 1 more this year with the whole milk bill. But if you look at that, that's relatively few laws, albeit, as you noted, 1 very big, beautiful bill, as they called it, with a lot of their priorities in it. But when you kind of look at this, what do you expect to happen over the next year or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just a pretty stark illustration of the point that we've been talking about more abstractly, that there's not a lot of action happening in Congress. Both Trump isn't asking them for a lot, he's not pushing them for a lot, and they don't have a whole lot that they're able to get done because of these narrow majorities on the House side, in particular, and again, the filibuster over on the Senate side. So it's been a historically unproductive Congress. I think some of this is also related to the fact that the president has made virtually no outreach to Democrats. Joe Biden, Republicans certainly did not like him, but they voted for example, the CHIPS and Science Act. There are a number of Republicans who voted for his infrastructure bill as much as they did not like him overall. The President Trump has really not shown any interest in bringing Democrats on board, and that further limits what Republicans are able to do. I think when you ask about looking forward, there's talk about, doing another reconciliation bill that could be Republican only in the Senate. I would say I'm extremely skeptical on that one. Last week, there were a couple of really basic labor bills that came up in the House, and they couldn't even get those things through. So when you're not able to pass those narrow bills, I don't really know how you're going to be able to pass a really big sweeping bill with lots of moving parts, especially as we get closer to election time, when a lot of House members are each going to kind of have to start looking out for their own individual political considerations and not necessarily being willing to take one for the team like they may have a year ago.
And I guess a couple other observations I'd make about this. One is just the number of CRA resolutions. That refers to the Congressional Review Act. That's a law that allows Congress to cancel rules that were passed by the administration. That tends to be a more useful tool when there's a change in party control, as there was obviously from when the Biden administration gave way to the Trump administration. And that was a significant chunk, I would say, of the 68 laws were about that, chipping away at some of the regulations and policy priorities of the Biden administration. So that was a big component of this. And you only need simple majorities in both chambers, which I think along with reconciliation, is one way they were able to notch some more wins on the board, if you will. And then another bill that we didn't call out here necessarily, but the defense authorization bill that was passed at the end of the year is another significant sweeping piece of legislation, I think more than 3,000 pages. So like we say, there were fewer, there's some very big ones and some very impactful ones, but that's generally how the first year kind of played out. I do want to touch a little bit on that One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and just if you could talk a little bit about maybe what you're hearing about how they're going to message this bill going into the midterms, or if there's a follow-on here that you would expect.
Yeah, I mean, it was called the One Big Beautiful Bill. I think that was something that appealed to the president, especially when there was a debate between House and Senate side about whether to do multiple bills. The Senate wanted, the House wanted to package it all together, and they called it the One Big Beautiful Bill. But now I think they're trying to reframe it. I think they're calling it something like, and I apologize if I don't have the exact words right, but the Tax Cut for Families Act, or something along those lines, to try to frame it more as something that they can sell outside of Washington, to tell people, hey, these are all these benefits that are going to start coming online. There's been a lot of polling that suggests a lot of dissatisfaction with the economy, which is A, traditionally Trump's strongest position or strongest issue, and B, typically the most important thing that voters are concerned about in an election year. And the polling's been very bad for Republicans on this. Their argument, their hope, is that as some of these laws start kicking in, as people start filing their taxes in April and they see the benefits of this bill, that will turn around their perceptions of the economy and turn around their perception of what Republicans have done with their trifecta here in Washington. So I think you're going to start hearing Republican leaders. In fact, we have already started hearing Republican leaders talk much more about this. John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, has spoken about it at press conferences on the Hill. He's traveling a little more around the country to try to tout this bill. The challenge for them is that the president is kind of in and out on the economic issues, in and out on affordability, in and out on talking about this particular issue. And even when he does, it's often overshadowed by things like his raid in Venezuela, his threats against Greenland, his board of peace. The president is really increasingly looking overseas. He's clearly got the biggest megaphone in American politics. And so it's an additional challenge for Republicans to sell the bill, even though they say that there's a lot of benefits that are going to come online this year that they believe will be popular.
Yeah, that's a natural segue to, I think, our next slide here, which is just the global picture. We know that the president's going to get on a plane pretty soon and head over to Davos for the World Economic Forum, where he'll meet with leaders. But what is kind of the vibe you're getting from members of Congress about the foreign policy decisions that are being made, some of these recent ones, some of the votes you've seen or are anticipating?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on the issue. This is one area where I think you might see a little more split between Republicans in Congress and the president. There are still a number of Republicans who kind of hold more traditional foreign policy views, kind of view things almost through the Cold War lens, where the United States is allied with Europe, and Russia and other similar countries are seen as enemies to be contained. But it is an area where the president has a lot of leeway as far as directing the administration's policies and directing the military in some cases. And so it's an area where he doesn't need Congress. And this is a president who likes action, who likes things that move fast. And foreign affairs is a place that really satisfies that for him. Whereas waiting for Congress to act on something takes a long time, takes a lot of persuasion, can get slow, can get bogged down, watered down. And it doesn't really suit this president's style or personality. I do think the issue in Greenland is one that's really, really going to test, or is testing, Republicans in Congress. You know, they've largely gone along with almost everything the president has done so far. Or if they've raised objections, they've been pretty muted without much teeth behind them. They've been saying pretty strongly that they're opposed to any, certainly military intervention in Greenland, and even any kind of forced takeover of the country. Even Speaker Mike Johnson has said he doesn't think it's a good idea. But Trump is still going. There's been a lot of Republicans. There have been a lot of things in Trump's history where Republicans say he's not going to do that, or he shouldn't do that, or we don't think he'll do that, and then he does it anyway. And then they kind of are playing catch up. And I think this has a risk of being another one. So I think there's a lot of opposition to it, but whether they're willing to take further steps to actually rein the president in, I think is going to be a big question. And he seems intent on kind of pressing that question because he's not backing down on this.
All right. Well, thank you for your initial thoughts there. Again, we're going to bring you back later for the Q&A. So people, if you have questions for John, let us know there. But now I'm going to bring in Stephen Lee, who's one of our regulatory reporters, as I said, to talk about what's been going on the regulatory side in the administration. So Stephen?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. What we have seen within the executive branch has been really a breathtaking deregulatory effort that I think surpasses anything that we've seen, certainly in recent memory. Obviously, Republican presidents have, for many generations, prioritized deregulation. And what we have seen from the Trump administration is a level of success that I think far surpasses anything that we've seen in many, many years. So I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to kind of step through what we have been seeing. And I'm going to focus on the environmental space, partly because that's what I'm most familiar with, but also because there's been so much activity in environmental and energy policy. So I think that's a good place to start. In this slide, we see some data about the number of executive orders that Trump has signed. And that is relevant because in so many cases, these EOs are being used as rationales to justify deregulation under what's known as, in many cases, the good cause exemption. And this is something that all presidents do, but it's probably fair to say that no president has ever done it as extensively or as effectively as Trump has. I'll just give you a couple of examples of EOs. On his first day in office, Trump signed an Unleashing American Energy EO that has been used as a predicate for expanding fossil fuel production and rare earth mining and kind of scraping back initiatives to boost EVs and renewable energy. He also signed a national energy emergency. That's a big one that boosts domestic oil and gas production to promote energy development in places like Alaska and to pause offshore wind. He has signed other EOs that, for instance, put America first in international environmental agreements. So that takes the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And another executive order that revokes mandates on environmental justice. And that is what forms the basis for ending government programs aimed at helping low-income communities of color. So these EOs could face legal challenges. It is possible that some of them might get turned back. But what we see from Trump, I think sort of his style is sort of to act first and then kind of force his opponents to respond and try to roll back what he's doing. In many cases, by then it's too late because programs have withered and died, or federal workers, and even then, the worst case for the Trump administration is that he might have to go back to the status quo, which is where they would have been anyway. Some of the specific rules that the administration has struck down in the environmental space. Again, it's a very broad range of actions. In one day in March, the EPA announced 31 deregulatory actions. Most of those rules took years to write and have been in place for years. And Trump has, in many cases, just gone ahead and struck them down. Some examples include, clean air, clean water, tailpipe emissions, permitting rules. These are regulations that Republicans have really targeted for a very long time, and Trump has gone in and just kind of obliterated them. And how is it that he's been able to do this? I think to a great extent, it is that he just has exercised political will that we haven't seen other presidents do. In previous years, we've seen Republican administrations that were sort of beholden to the rules, that when you want to get rid of a regulation, you do it the proper way, which is through notice and comment. It takes a really long time. You're, open to court challenges. Trump has, in many cases, just kind of blown through those norms. And for instance, one way that he has done that has been by issuing direct final rules, so just sort of in one fell swoop getting rid of it. And again, he's vulnerable to legal challenges, but I think that what we see consistently is that, by just going ahead and taking action, he puts his opponents on the defensive. And we know also that it is much harder to create regulations. It just takes such a long time than it does in many cases to get rid of them. And so I don't know that we can be sure that a future Democratic administration is going to be able to restore some of these regulations that have been taken down.
Thanks so much, Stephen. We'll get back to the regulatory questions a little bit when we get to the Q&A section, so please feel free to ask about them there. But now I did want to turn to Kate Ackley, bring her in to talk a little bit about how K Street and the influence in industry in Washington has been both responding to this and helping their clients respond. So Kate, what are your initial
observations? It's been a big year. It's been a big year for K Street and outside influence. Obviously, this agenda that you've been hearing about over the last 20 minutes or so of President Trump has really disrupted the influence industry. There's a real sense that there are a shrinking sort of spheres of influence. Congress, Capitol Hill still matters. But just look at what the Trump and President Trump has done even this year, not to mention over the past 12 months, but just to give a little insight in this first little bullet point here, this push for a credit card interest cap that President Trump put out on a Friday evening, 2 Fridays ago. It really scrambled up the bank and Wall Street and sort of credit card industry lobby. 8:00 p.m., a message on Truth Social from President Trump saying, pushing for this credit card interest cap. Something that the industry is not in favor of course. And so that started off a scramble of an entire weekend of, lobbying groups, banking lobbies, et cetera, trying to get ready to push back and pushing back actually with a statement that night and then continuing, through the weekend. And then, of course, last week, a unified statement from some of those banking industry groups. So you see, there's sort of no downtime. You have to mobilize in a moment's notice. Defense companies are truly on defense over this stock buyback pitch that the administration has been putting out. And again, it's a real level of involvement in corporate America that some presidents have tried to do, some administrations have tried to do, but this is a real blitz. Lots of different areas, lots of different sectors. So putting, people who represent these companies on guard, from CEO to obviously the lobbyists here in Washington that represent these companies. President Trump at the end of last year and then really ramped this up this year, attacking health insurance companies. And if you read the administration's health plan that it put out last week, there were attacks again on health insurance companies saying, we want to give money to Americans to spend on their health care, but don't want to give it to health insurance companies. Obviously, a lot of devil in the details in that. But the point being that health insurance industry executives and their lobbyists are on high alert about this. This is not something that they can just sort of roll their eyes or shrug their shoulders. This is a serious attack from the President of the United States. We also saw one of the things that this president likes to do is to have meetings with CEOs and top executives. So we saw that fairly recently with the situation in Venezuela. he convened a meeting with big oil executives, CEOs mostly, in the White House, and really put the pressure on them to invest billions of dollars to rebuild Venezuela's, sort of decrepit oil sector and infrastructure. Some of those CEOs were more ready to embrace that idea than others. And again, it sort of makes the lobbyists that represent those companies, that sector, really on high alert, waiting for anything. And the international uncertainty, Venezuela is a good example of that. The year started off with this, a military effort in Venezuela. Really took many people, most of us, I would imagine, by surprise. There's this sort of international uncertainty hanging over many things, and we've seen foreign governments turn to well-connected lobbyists in a really a fever pitch. Foreign governments, foreign corporations, anyone who's sort of operating in the international sphere is on high alert. I mean, we're talking about Denmark hired a lobbying firm that has ties to the Trump administration last year, with all the discussion about Greenland. And then, of course, the Greenland discussion, as has been noted already, has just skyrocketed this year and is going on right now. And so mobilizing those people who can presumably get meetings with the administration, get meetings with the president, get meetings with others in the White House, those folks are in really high demand right now.
And Kate, I'll go ahead and pull over the next slide. Who are some of the people that you've been tracking over the course of this year and who you'll, I assume, be watching very closely as they file by the end of the day today on what they're earning this year or last year?
Right. This is a big day in sort of the registered lobbying land, if you will, with the fourth quarter Lobbying Disclosure Act reports coming in, as you note, Lauren. Those are due by midnight. And we've already seen 3/4 of the year, 3/4 of 2025. And as this slide just makes crystal clear, firms that have a real legitimate ties or connections to the Trump administration have seen a huge boost. Ballard Partners became the #1 firm as measured by federal lobbying revenue under the Lobbying Disclosure Act by the third quarter, edging out Brownstein Hyatt and other big firms. Brian Ballard, of course, has the sort of claim to fame as having represented Trump at one point in Florida, and he's a longtime Florida lobbyist, and came on the scene in Washington in 2017 in Trump's first term, but has just the Trump 2.0 has catapulted that firm, and again, likely to be the #1, the top firm of 2025. It's important to note it is a bipartisan firm, but it was the firm where Attorney General Pam Bondi worked before going into this administration. And there are other people that have come actually from the Trump 2.0 administration and have taken roles at Ballard Partners. So there are multiple connections to people, current and former Trump administration officials or people with connections to the administration and to the president. BGR Group is another one that had big growth through the third quarter of last year, and we can presume, and we'll see the numbers tonight, but has grown a lot over the past year. They have a Trump-connected lobbyist, David Urban, and then just also very strong ties to, Republicans in Congress and others who work who went into the administration. And it is a bipartisan firm, but it had, its roots really in Republican officials. Another one that has seen big explosive growth over the past year. Checkmate Government Relations was a firm that a year ago, I don't think hardly anybody was even talking about. It's a firm that was founded a few years ago in North Carolina. The person who runs the firm, Chess McDowell, is a hunting pal of Donald Trump Jr., and he also has a brother who's serving in Congress. So lots of touch points. They have someone who worked for HHS Secretary or has ties to HHS Secretary Kennedy. So again, multiple touch points. That firm has gone just basically from zero to a multi-million-dollar practice. They've had a lot of high-profile, interesting work, including working pro bono. So even that money isn't for this, but pro bono for the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, which just won full federal recognition, a big deal for that tribe. They wanted, it was a provision included in the annual defense policy bill. So a big win for that tribe and the lobbyist Sarah Checkmate who were working on that. Another firm, Miller Strategies, the firm of Jeff Miller, who, we were looking at him back when Kevin McCarthy was speaker. He was a Kevin McCarthy person, but has parlayed his contacts and obviously grown the firm. It's a Republican firm with ties to, doing fundraisers for President Trump and doing a lot of fundraising for Republicans who are in charge on Capitol Hill. So that's been another firm really just catapulting into a level that it had not been before, as clients, corporations, lobbying groups really strive to find people that are well connected, because this is, as some of the other presenters were making clear, this is an administration where you sort of have limited spheres of influence. If President Trump wants to do something, he often will do it. Maybe others will later say we have to roll this back, or you can't do that, or what have you. But this is a president that sets the agenda in many respects and will put out policy statements and get industry scrambled. And so therefore the people who have ties and connections to the administration are very, very much in demand. And one of the things that we've looked at just on the cusp of this 1 year mark today is looking at some of the people who have left Trump 2.0, and we've seen them go to places like Ballard Partners, Miller Strategies, the CGCN Group, another firm that has strong Republican connections and has former Trump 1.0 and now Trump 2.0 officials. This is just sort of a list of people that we have tracked. There are many people who are probably, according to lobbyist headhunters and lobbying firms, there are discussions ongoing right now with firms and trade associations, corporate in-house operations who are looking to hire people who are leaving the Trump administration right now in good standing to sort of capitalize on their contacts, and that they know how this administration works and can try to find those pressure points on behalf of clients. So this is just a little sampling of some of the high profile people, but you see that Intel Corporation, for example, tapped someone who had been in the White House. Other people have started their own firms and are signing up clients, including foreign governments, domestic clients, PR and messaging type clients. It sort of runs the gamut. So we're going to be watching throughout this year, what does the administration's agenda, what do President Trump's messages on Truth Social, what sort of does that prompt in terms of lobbying and influence? The people who are registered lobbyists, of course, we see that, but then the influencers, the people who are on social media or who can sort of do things behind the scenes to sell their client's pitch in a way that will resonate for this White House. Maybe a ballroom donation or a trip to Mar-a-Lago, a meeting with the CEO. Lots and lots of levers of influence that they're looking at into the next 3 years of this administration.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Kate. We're going to go ahead and bring everybody back in now so that we can go through some of the questions you submitted. If you do have questions, please use the questions widget on the right side of your video screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. I'm going to start going back to you, John, first, this is a question that could have gone a different way depending on if the Supreme Court had ruled today on tariffs. They did not. We're still waiting for that ruling to come. But is there any appetite in Congress to legislate on tariffs? And do you think that that Supreme Court ruling could factor into that at all?
I mean, I do think the court ruling could factor into it, because I think there's a lot of members of Congress who are hoping that the Supreme Court takes care of this and maybe strikes it down. I think a lot of members in both parties would prefer that outcome. As far as legislating, I would not 100% rule it out, but I think it's very, very unlikely. I think maybe you could have a secret ballot. Maybe you could see some number of Democrats and Republicans would vote to strike down tariffs, or at least pare back tariffs. I think if their votes were kept quiet. As far as an actual legislation and a public vote to rebuke the president on probably his signature economic policy, I don't see there being enough people to pass that through both chambers. Certainly not enough to override the inevitable veto that would happen. As far as looking down the line, and when you think about this, part of what's informing my answer here is that Congress, has basically ceded power over tariffs since the 1930s. Now, the difference is that often that's been the presidents have lowered tariffs in the interest of encouraging international trade, and now we're seeing a president who's going in the opposite direction and contradicting what a lot of traditional Republicans still believe. But you've got to remember, there's also a large number of senators who are Republican senators who are kind of molded in President Trump's image and support tariffs. And there's a number of Democrats who are embracing a little bit of more economic populism, who say, well, they don't like Trump's tariffs specifically, but they like the idea of tariffs and helping American businesses. So I don't see it happening under this president. Under the next president, could it happen? Maybe, assuming that the next president probably doesn't have the same kind of power over his own party or necessarily vindictiveness that Trump has shown. But historically, once one party claims the power for the White House, the next president is not giving that back. So I think it's, again, not impossible, but very unlikely is how I would.
And Kate, I just want to go to you for 1 second. Have you been hearing much on K Street or from corporations about tariffs? Is this somewhere where they think they can make ground, or are they just kind of rolling with what's going on?
This has definitely been a top issue over the past year. And one of the things when some of the lobbying groups or companies early on, in response to the tariffs on Canada and Mexico, when some of them pushed back, they got, according to various sources, they got pushback from the White House saying, these are, this is all part of a deal making, don't make too much of a fuss publicly. And so what you saw, it was kind of a quick pivot where many industries, companies, they were pretty careful about what they said, really all throughout last year. I mean, it's clear that they don't love tariffs and they've made that pretty clear, but they talk about it in a way that's a little bit delicate, kind of gentle messaging, because they don't want to necessarily get crosswise with the president or his administration. So I think everybody is really holding their breath about this Supreme Court decision to see where do things go from there. But, meanwhile, many sectors or even specific companies are working quietly to try to get carve outs or say, well, we can't have a tariff on this because we don't make anything like this in the United States. So there are different sectors that are approaching this differently, but I'd say all of them are fairly cautious and careful not to get crosswise and try to make individual bargains, if possible, with the administration.